Land of the Great Sky, Part 1. On an open plain of green, untrodden grass, the white gleaming sun lit the vista, the immensity of the cloudless sky rendering the carriage and its escorts trivial beneath it. To the party, the quiet of the steppe was no comfort, and the sun was their enemy, draining the meager water they had from their bodies and those of their horses. The sergeant of this party had subsided in his demands for their standard bearer, modest though the standard was, to hold the Burgundy pennant aloft. Even the seasoned leader reached the depths of his own exhaustion. The carriage they escorted was a strange piece of equipment to the knights, an iron construction with caterpillar tracks, driven by a team of monstrous oxen whose physiology defied what the farmers of their distant homeland could ever hope to breed, let alone handle. The cargo was a shipment of textiles and crafts from the west, bound for the walled city of the Serenissima. John Casimir, heir to a defunct barony across the wide ocean, rode behind the carriage, as was customary to those on their first tour of duty as a knight on the steppe. His mouth was dry and canteen long ago emptied. At his saddle he had pistols of fine craftsmanship and a cavalry saber at his belt. His eyelids were heavy, as if they were as much a burden as his cuirass, and he struggled to remain awake. Unlike his peers, he had not yet adopted the rudiments of the local costume, light mail coats over a cotton kaftan. He still wore the breastplate and helmet of the West and the coastlands. Sergeant, John rode up beside the party leader and ventured. "We must halt for water," he said, coughing as his throat scratched. To his surprise, the knights who regarded him as an interloper, as they did all replacements, gave sympathetic groans. For a common soldier to attempt a remark to a superior would have been at best in poor judgment, but John did outrank the sergeant in the peerage, and such candor was to be expected. "Back," the sergeant grunted, "to your position in the column." The sergeant's chest heaved as if by taking enough air he could replace the water so desperately needed. John did not argue and began to return to his position. One of the other knights, named Martel Sarto, rode beside the sergeant. "This boy is correct," he said, and soon the older Martel and the sergeant began to talk, as silently as one could in such a situation, and the Serenissima agent who sat on the wagon took interest. He wore dark clothes and a wide-brimmed black hat and red-lensed glasses. When John first saw him at the caravanserai on the coast, he thought the man looked like a circus performer, or perhaps like one of the underground bards in the capital. In fact, the man was so mechanical in personality and affect, it was as if he was a construct. His spindly, long-fingered hands did not improve the impression of his affect. John was no stranger to double crosses and intrigues, and considered it not a matter of if he might attempt to harm the knights, but when. The agent's companion, the carriage driver, was a gaunt and pale Serenissima slave. He appeared to be an old man, smiling irrationally at their circumstances, but one could never know the true age of their slaves, nor deduce their sanity. The irony that a city once founded by escaped slaves turned to the same cargo was remarked upon enough in the last centuries that it had become mere cliche among those informed about the world. The knights had no illusion this agent was of low character, but he was the buyer of their goods from the west. The behemoth oxen and the iron carriage halted, and the weary knights took notice. The agent stood up on the carriage seat, arms at his waist, in what was to them an awkward pose. "What could you coastals have to argue about?" "My Don," the sergeant said, "my men need water, as do our horses." Your defective equipment is not my concern. Indeed, even the Boborids have not dwelled in the past with mere natural animals. His driver continued to wear the same eerie smile and took only the smallest sips from a tiny bottle around his neck and returned to his position of holding the reins. Martel visibly chafed at the merchant's boldness. This is the wild steppe in the domain of the Red Wolf Horde. You are a fool to believe the cargo, protected as it is, will survive, and they leave you unmolested. The sergeant protested Martel, but only as strongly as his exhaustion permitted. What is worse, a regular occurrence of land piracy by one of the steppe begs, or a mutinous band of knights, really no more than hired swords beneath the pretensions of nobility, who threaten war between my felicitous city and the collection of hovels you possess on the coast. Sergeant, you must tell your equipment never to speak again. If your city is so great, why do you not bring your own soldiers? John attempted, already weary of the agent's sanctimonious inflection. The agent ignored him. We shall continue, or there will be no payment for any of the equipment before me, nor the completed contract to return to your owners. With this edict, the wagon resumed its brisk push across the steppe, and the knights mustered no further energy for protests. The 8 riders shared knowing expressions with one another, and rode on, with John taking his place at the back. They continued this way until, praise the Redeemer, they found the bank of the Aksu River that flowed with a fine current of clean water the next day. The agent permitted them reprieve for some time, rather unexpectedly, as he consulted a sheaf of maps and turned the wheels of the mechanical adding machine that fit in his hand. Refreshed by the clean water of the river, John stared out the wide plains and the sky that loomed so much larger than it did in the cool wooded lands of his late estate. He longed for it now, the manor house and the fine men who worked the land around it. But it was never to be his, lost in a petty feud and signed away to another family by a judge in lieu of yet another baron's war. But the steppe at this moment transfixed him with its emptiness and its richness. It was at once a picture of opportunity and danger. He heard stories that great cities once teemed the valleys here millennia ago, but most were now lost. During his tutoring, he had often nodded through the lessons of history and the ancient languages that have been imposed upon him. Such topics seemed trifling compared to the reality of life in the baronies, the need for practical subjects and experience. But he cannot help and feel in this more ancient part of the world that he was very small indeed. Martel approached him as they camped, and John stood and saluted, but the older knight shook his head. You ought to take off that plate and helmet. John was confused. It shines so red wolves can see it from the horizon. Very well, John said, I will leave them off when we set out. Indeed, I also know not if they have an accord with the Archduke, but they plunder the caravans of the Serenissima unprovoked. It is much different than even the Baron's wars, the fighting and the peace here. Peace seems a simpler proposition, John said and paused. Perhaps we may dine when we arrive to Serenissima. Martel stiffened. I did not approach you for friendship night. I am not to be seen dining with someone who has just come off the boats. The older knight returned to his horse and baggage. Wounded, John sank into daydreams again, but he knew they were just dreams and inflicted more pain upon him. Before his departure, he was in a state of deep melancholy and poor finances, possessing a fine title, but no lands and no hope for an appointment. Sergeant, the agent wailed, Sergeant, we will proceed to the ford 5 miles from the site. They formed the caravan again and did as instructed. The ford was at a bend in the river as its course changed from northbound to eastbound. As they followed the path of the river, the quality of the ground beneath them changed slightly. A series of ruins came into view, one of the ghost cities that dotted the steppe. John had seen drawings in books and older manuscripts during his schooling, conjectural ones of the opulence that they apparently had possessed at one time. Buildings now had no outer layer or decoration left. They seemed square, but in most places only foundations remained. the distance, two ruined towers kept watch, their sentries having long since died. The iron carriage approached the shallow of the river and began to move across, the iron tracks crunching the stones of the ford. The sergeant ordered 4 men to fan out in the direction of the ruins and watch for an ambush from the Red Wolf riders. Martel took this vanguard, and John remained with the wagon. Despite their careful planning, across the river, dismounted steppe braves appeared from hiding places in the taller grass patches and fired their muskets, the shots striking the iron carriage with pings, and some hitting the behemoth oxen with seemingly no effect. A ball whistled by John, and he rode toward the enemy, crossing the ford. The moment it took for his horse to press on through even the shallow water made his gut lurch as more muskets discharged in the direction of the caravan. Once he cleared the opposite bank, he drew one pistol and fired at one of the raiders, and then drew his sword. The sergeant and 3 other knights joined him, bearing down with their spears on the attackers. Some of the braves tried to scatter, while others loaded their muskets again, and the knights slew those that stood. John fired his other pistol point blank at a red wolf, taking aim at another knight, and then pursued fleeing enemy before the sergeant recalled him. Across the river from the ruins, a band of mounted red wolves rushed Martel's wing with chilling cries and shooting a hail of arrows. Martel and his men drew their own bows. The two war parties flowed into one another, the knights dressed so alike to their enemy, John could not distinguish him in the strange archery melee. Archery subsided, and the throng became locked into a clash of sabers, and Martel's imposing shape stood out as he brought down attackers, forcing many from their saddles. Before John could set off to join them, the sergeant commanded him to stay with the wagon. Inexplicably to a mind accustomed to warfare, the wagon driver continued on a straight path and was across the river. The agent had taken cover inside the wagon, entering a hatch on top of the iron monstrosity, but the driver went on undeterred. Seized by anger against the sergeant, John crossed back over the river, saber drawn, and plunged into the melee, struck down a red wolf on the fringe. The main mass of men and horses was about to draw his bow. Indeed, John had crashed into the back of the raiders who were attempting shots into the combat, fought them off, forcing them from the skirmish by wounds or fatal blows, and taking cuts from sabers and lances. Despite holding his ground, Martel saw John and fought off the rest. All of Martel's companions were dead, and the knights were almost about to waver when a shot cracked from one of the ancient towers and threw a red wolf from his horse. Not a minute later, another rang out from the same direction, and then another. Confused, the raiders yelped and rode away in a cloud of dust and a clatter of hoofs. The knights all appeared confused, and the engagement ended, the enemy riding toward the ruins. To the skirmish, Martel rode alongside John as they recovered on the other side of the water, carriage gaining distance on them. "You are foolish," he said, abandoning the wagon. "Discipline is my task, Martel," the sergeant said. He commanded the knight to join the wagon as it pressed on, and he and the other survivors rode out. "You," the sergeant said, stabbing a finger at John, "are not to move to the front or charge unless I order it." John gritted his teeth. "I am the Baron of St. Ingo's, and I have every right to take part as an equal of this squadron. I fought with my father 3 seasons in the Baron's wars. This is not the old country. You will kill the squadron with your recklessness. Dare I even say, lest it offend your sensibilities, we are hired contractors operating a business." Such a statement in the baronies was tantamount to profanity. While they argued back and forth, the source of the musketry observed them. The main caravan, the observer noted their position on a map, already full of notes indicating their position and date. Flummoxed by the interruption, he returned to his proper work inside the ancient tower. The sergeant and John finished their exchange out of pragmatism, neither man getting what they wanted out of the interaction, and set off at a swift gallop to rejoin the wagon and remaining men. Bodies of the fallen knights, the sergeant said they would attend to on the return journey. John grimaced at the second sacrilege in scarcely 20 minutes. At least, he reflected, they now had water